Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we take to the air once more, but this time on the trail of one of the unsung heroes of the Great War, the carrier pigeon. Equally vital for communication on the front lines, maintaining unit cohesion in battle, or as a handy snack in emergencies, we'll explore their role and the stories of a few famous birds who took to the skies above the Western Front. Well, hello again, Dan. A few weeks ago, it was rats burrowing through the trenches, and today it's carrier pigeons soaring above them. And one thing we mentioned in the rats episode was that if you're a soldier on the Western Front, you would have encountered rats. They were absolutely ubiquitous, couldn't get away from them as we discussed. But the other animal you were very likely to see at some point, even though you might not interact with one, would be a carrier pigeon, because staggering numbers of carrier pigeons would be used by all sides during the First World War. And I think that they're a fascinating and some ways misunderstood story, because we think of the First World War in terms of machine guns, tanks, aircraft, the dawn of modern warfare, shell craters, massive casualties. And we can sometimes see pictures. There's one I'm thinking of in particular, which is a carrier pigeon being released from a British tank, and see the carrier pigeon as an anachronism and almost quaint within the context of this modern war. But Dan, I think that does a disservice to carrier pigeons and just how important and useful they were.
Absolutely, incredibly useful, and I'm for one. I'm looking forward to this. A bit like the rats episode last week. I've learnt a huge amount about carrier pigeons over the last week, which has been great fun. I have to admit, I did throw in the handy snack bit as a bit of a joke. I can't really back that up, but I suspect at some point somebody ate a carrier pigeon during the Great War. So, but what we need to do, of course, first of all, is just understand a little bit about carrier pigeons, which also come in different guises, as it turns out. I didn't know that until recently either. But, why are carrier pigeons so important? What's their use? How do they work? Which is an interesting one that I think is quite misunderstood. But let's start at the beginning though, Spence, because the carrier pigeons, they've been around for a very long time and they've been used way back into antiquity as well. So this isn't a new bit of technology by the time of the First World War.
No, it's not. This is something that's been used really since the dawn of warfare, used by the Persian Empire, used in ancient Egypt, used in ancient Rome, because, of course, pigeons have a fairly unique ability to home, and not dissimilar to other animals, other creatures that can find their way to spawning grounds, for example, salmon being the classic example. The full science of how a bird actually homes is not entirely understood. There's a number of theories, a range of ideas associated with this. So pigeons might use the sun as a compass and be able to adjust it for times of day. They might be more like salmon and have some sort of sense of the Earth's magnetic field, which might be allow them to find their way to certain locations. Pigeons have a good sense of smell. Despite, you might not think of birds having a good sense of smell, but they do, and they can smell their home area at some distance due to its smell being carried on the wind. They seem to have an ability to memorize areas, so they can see familiar roads and rivers. And indeed, in the current pigeon racing scene, it's noted that pigeons prefer to follow highways and coastlines rather than flying in straight lines. They do not fly as the crow flies. They prefer to follow geographic routes. They might also be able to use low-frequency infrasound as well, so bouncing things off mountains, or oceans, large objects that allow them to navigate too. So there's a range of wonderful evolutionary advantages that pigeons have that will allow them to get to where their home is. And so from the earliest times, they've been used in this way, and they've also they quickly get adapted into modern war as well. And in the 19th century, this time when you are having telegraphs, when you are on the eve of seeing the invention of the telephone, carrier pigeons and homing pigeons are still very, very popular. And there's this sort of slight interregnum period between widespread use of the telegraph, which can be a little expensive, and has its own reliability problems. You have to send it from one station to another. And before the telephone becomes widely used, into which the First World War and indeed the late Victorian period tends to fall into. And so that's when carrier pigeons, in a military sense, are going to fill those gaps. Armies generally aren't fighting next to big telephone exchanges, at least not in the 19th century, big telegraph exchanges. Sometimes units are out on a limb. Sometimes units have lost access to telegraphs or telephones. And that's when carrier pigeons, even in the 19th century, are going to be seen as incredibly useful. And that they are used in the Franco-Prussian War, for example, as a way for units to try and stay in touch with each other and prove effective in that war. And I think that's an important point, Dan, that this isn't a sort of desperate lunge for a solution to communications. This has a lineage that goes back a very, very long time.
Yeah, I mean, you can go to really any period in history. You can go right back to the Persian Empire, 1,000 years BC. We've got accounts of Pliny the Younger using carrier pigeons and Julius Caesar sending carrier pigeons all the way to Gaul, to modern-day France. All of this kind of thing, So these have been used for a long time. And of course, at the time, nobody really understood how they did what they did. And even today, with all the modern technology, those bits you mentioned, Spence, we've got a general understanding that those various elements that pigeons have can combine to create some kind of homing method, but we don't really know exactly how it works. And maybe the point is that we don't necessarily need to. What you need to know is that you can take a pigeon somewhere. It could be a battlefield. It could be somewhere that's important out. For example, if you're flying a seaplane and your plane goes down, you've got a carrier pigeon with you, you can release it. And no matter what's going on, it will 95% of the time find its way home. That's an incredibly useful thing to have. Now, nobody, unfortunately, developed a method of getting the carrier pigeon to come back again afterwards. But, that's, one of the limitations of carrier pigeons. But clearly, they are useful. Also worth mentioning as well, other forms of communication in the First World War that are quicker, overground lines, underground lines, etc., signaling. These things are all tappable. This is information that you can take from the enemy. Much harder to do that from a carrier pigeon, albeit all major sides do try in some form or another during the war. But I think we should just understand for a minute here exactly what carrier pigeons can do, because they are a very reliable method of communication. They can, on rare occasions, go up to 60 miles an hour in speed. It's very impressive, 100 kilometers an hour for those of you in that part of the world. And let's take a comparison here to give you an idea. So car traveling at motorway speed, for example, let's go for 25 miles. Motorway speed, car, 25 miles, going to do that in 24 minutes. Peregrine falcon, fastest bird in the world, is going to travel that same 25 miles, going to cover that in 24 minutes. Can't home them, though. Can't tell it where to go. It just go where it wants to go. Homing pigeon can cover 25 miles in about 34 minutes. That's very impressive. Galloping horse, which is really the method prior to that, and of course, you can't gallop a horse to 25 miles. You kill the thing. It's not going to be able to do that. It's not sustainable. Would take 43 minutes with a rider on it. And an elite marathon runner, Spence, think about the Battle of Marathon back in the Spartan times. The guy who famously dies at the steps after delivering that message. Well, he could only run that distance in 120 minutes. Carrier pigeon's been there 3/4 of the time longer by the time that arrives. So this gives you an idea of actually how effective these things can be. It's also worth mentioning range here, because a top racing pigeon could do up to 500 miles in a single trip. It's a staggering number, and find its home loft at the end of it. So this could be somewhere that it's never been before. Carrier pigeons are not just designed to go to somewhere that they know well. They can literally be placed anywhere, somewhere they've never visited before in their lives, thrown up into the air, and somehow find their way home. That's a really remarkable thing. As I say, the success rate for this, 12 hours a day of flying for a carrier pigeon, that's this kind of maximum length that they can do. They can, provided the weather's good, they're going to get to their destination 95% of the time. Now, if you put that in context of the First World War, that's a very reliable method of communicating anywhere really on the battlefield. And it's, as we say, it's untappable. There's going to be some real positive things associated to carrier pigeons. But I don't know, what do you think in terms of its use within the British Army and other nations' armies as well? Because at the start of the war, you've got the Belgians, the Germans, the French, and the Ottomans are all operating a carrier pigeon service within their military. They're using this in a day-in, day-out process. The British Army, on the other hand, has actually got rid of it, and they got rid of their service in about 1908. And so they've got to restart to learn this process, but it almost immediately proves its worth.
This is interesting too about the British Army abandoning its experiments, and they are limited experiments with carrier pigeons. And keen-eared listeners, I'm very interested in the Boer War of 1899 to 1902. Well, carrier pigeons aren't used in that war at all, even though they would be potentially very, very useful in the vast distances of South Africa. And in the aftermath of the war, there's a lot of thinking in the British Army about, well, what do we do? What do we learn from this? What can we learn from Europe? And one of the ideas is, well, communications was a problem in South Africa. We'll try carrier pigeons. Curiously, one of the reasons, there's two reasons, but one of the reasons why the British Army abandons carrier pigeon experiments is they say, well, the British Army's small. It often fights in very unusual environments. You might be on the mountains, the northwest frontier, or the jungles of Burma, or the deserts of Sudan. And we don't think that carrier pigeons are universally useful across the globe. That's questionable, but that's one of the reasons given. The main reason is money. There's never enough money in the British Army prior to 1914. Can't do anything with, well, very limited what you can do. Carrier pigeons are a bit expensive and they seem a bit niche, so they get abandoned. It means the British Army goes to war without any carrier pigeons, in contrast to the French and the Germans. And in some ways, this is odd because pigeon racing is a big European phenomenon, which includes Britain. There are pigeon racing, there's pigeon fancying, as it's called, which is basically breeding the most beautiful pigeon. These are big, big participation sports in Britain, especially in the north of England, prior to the First World War. So there's a ready supply of pigeons for the British Army. It's just that it doesn't actually go to war with them. By contrast, of course, the Germans and the French, and indeed the Ottomans as well, go to war with these birds right at the start. When you were laying out, Dan, about the importance and the value of pigeons, they can always make it home, or make it home with a very high percentage chance. They're fast. And crucially, of course, they fly as well, which means they're difficult to intercept. A man running on the ground, a runner, whether he's on a horse, whether he's on foot, he's got to cross broken terrain. If he's in a battle area, there's going to be bullets, there's going to be explosions, there's going to be soldiers in his way, there's going to be roadblocks. It's going to delay him. And as we know, being a runner, carrying messages in the First World War was one of the deadliest jobs you could have. You have to run and take risks in very, very intense environments. Better if you can give it to a pigeon because they can fly above it. Now, yes, there are shell bursts, there are aircraft flying around and things, but think about how tiny a pigeon is. Much more likely to make it through than a man on the ground. And this is something that the British Army learns very, very quickly. Number of problems in August 1914 on the Great Retreat are down to communication failures and communication problems. And by September, so actually just at the very tail end of the Battle of the Marne, the French, so often the sort of the force that guides the British, especially in the early part of the First World War, actually make a donation to British headquarters of 50 French pigeons. So that the very first pigeons in British service are going to be French, Dan.
They are indeed, and it's the 11th September 1914 when those 50 French pigeons are presented to British headquarters with quite a lot of ceremony. And I wonder if there's a slight dig in there saying, yeah, we've noticed you guys probably need these things. So they're handed over. And actually, we have a really interesting quote here, which I think sums up where the story of pigeons in the Great War is going to go, because the quote that comes with it says, "These birds were used for intelligence purposes only, but from this small beginning was destined to grow a great branch of the signal service, which in 1918 numbered 20,000 birds with a personnel of 380 experts. No less than 90,000 men in battalions and other units have been trained to care for and fly pigeons." Like everything in the Great War, there's an exponential growth in this because it's seen to prove its worth so early on. So we're going to see that, and we'll talk through as we go through this episode exactly why that's such an important thing. But it's also worth pointing out as well that there are inherent risks with pigeons. As you said, Spence, the UK has got a big pigeon fancying and pigeon racing scene at the start of the war. But when the Defence of the Realm Act comes along in 1914, which says, well, we need to think about these kind of things which could potentially pose a danger to the United Kingdom, somebody comes along and says, well, first of all, we could do with some pigeons because we got rid of all our military ones at the start of the war. But also, we don't like the idea of somebody having something which could be flown, for example, to Germany with some information attached to it. And so we've got an announcement made, Spence, on the 30th of November as part of the DORA regulations, which kind of takes into account and covers that bit off. What does it tell us?
It really does cut this off, and it just ties to this fear, which is fascinating in Britain, that there's spies everywhere. Pre-war invasion literature has been a big publishing phenomenon prior to the First World War. Lurid stories about Britain being overthrown, usually by Germany, although not always, usually through some sort of subterfuge and treachery. And so pigeons, which are now, of course, being used for communication, there's a real fear, well, pigeons are going to be misused. There's going to be Germans sending off all kinds of messages through pigeons. So DORA regulations on the 30th of November 1914 state quite clearly, no person shall keep or have in his possession or carry or liberate or bring into the United Kingdom any carrier or homing pigeons unless he has obtained from the Chief Officer of Police of the district a permit for the purpose. And if any person without lawful authority contravenes the provisions of this regulation, he shall be guilty of an offence against these regulations, and the Chief Officer of Police or any Officer of Customs and Excise may, if he considers it necessary or expedient to do so, cause any pigeons kept or brought into the United Kingdom in contravention of this regulation to be liberated, detained, or destroyed, or in the case of pigeons brought into the United Kingdom, to be immediately returned in the ship in which they came. Any person found in possession of or found carrying or liberating any carrier pigeons shall, if so required by any naval or military officer or by any sailor or soldier engaged on sentry patrol or other similar duty, or by any officer of police, produce his permit, and if he fails to do so, may be arrested. And this is serious. This is a serious piece of legislation in a country which has a big pigeon racing and pigeon fancying community. This is how serious the pigeon population is taken. And we might sort of look at this and go, well, is this overemphasizing things? Potentially not, because there's big concerns in late 1914 about diseases coming from French pigeon stock, or indeed other nationalities' pigeon stock, getting into British pigeon stock and causing problems. It's easy to forget that Britain in Western Europe was the only country that had eliminated rabies from its animal population before the First World War. And although pigeons don't carry rabies, fortunately, pigeons do carry a number of contagious diseases, and there was deep concern. This is going to poison the pigeon stock, either by accident, you brought some French pigeons, they're carrying a disease, an epidemic, or by German subterfuge and sabotage, try and send diseased birds to Britain. As far as you know, there was never any plans to do this. But I think the point, Dan, is from having no pigeon service when the war breaks out to having to accept 50 donated pigeons from the French to, in November, so just 3 months after the French donation, now passing regulations saying, whatever you do, protect Britain's pigeon stocks. I think that just shows how quickly and dramatically the importance of pigeons has grown.
Yeah, and we really see this play out on the battlefield as well, particularly in the First Battle of the Marne, where the French and the British, they've been retiring for quite some time. There's a lot of confusion on the battlefield. And actually being able to get messages back and forth is extremely important and extremely difficult to do. And actually the French perform very well with their pigeons, and the British don't have that. And so that's why we see that donation, and that's where we see this kind of kernel of the story of pigeons in the Great War really comes to fruition, at least through British eyes. Bear in mind, the French are going to continue to use these throughout the Great War with good effect, most famously at the Battle of Verdun. But, it also comes with new things that you've got to learn, because not only do you need to have pigeons, you've got to train them. And, whilst we say that, yes, they do have a homing technique, they can make their way home. You need to get them to do it efficiently. You don't want them flying off eastwards and staying out there for a couple of hours. You actually need to train them. And so we start to see the development of training schools. What's really remarkable about this, I should say, is the fact that the British Army, much like it does with people like miners, where you really want specialists, there's no point taking a private soldier in the army and saying, right, well, let's train you as a pigeon fancier. Let's train you as somebody that knows how to work carrier pigeons. Why don't we just get people who know how to deal with carrier pigeons and just put them in the army instead? And that's exactly what they do. So the British Army, as early as late 1914, starts looking around the UK saying, we want people to serve. And as a result of that, we want them so much, we're going to really stretch the boundaries of everything we do. We're going to increase the upper age limit to 49 years old. So you can join the army up to 49 years old if you're an expert in pigeons. And we're going to start to see the development of the first pigeon carrier service sections, which are eventually going to expand out to a really huge network. I think that's interesting. It gives you a little glimpse, I think, Spence, of just how important the British Army realizes this is.
It does. And it also shows that the British Army is playing catch up. So the French and the Germans have their pigeon sections prior to the war where they train people to be pigeon handlers, pigeon experts. Britain doesn't have that. And you made a great point, Dan, that it's got some similarities to tunnelers, which we covered many episodes ago, where the Royal Engineers say, do you know what? It's a lot quicker to recruit a miner and get him to mine than it is to train a Royal Engineer, who is a little bit of a jack of all trades. They're expected to be able to do all kinds of engineering work rather than train a soldier to do this quite highly specialized task. Let's recruit somebody who already knows how to do it, put him in a uniform, and we'll worry about making him a soldier later. And that leads to the creation of the highly effective tunneling branch of the army. And it leads also to a number of other branches, including, of course, the signal service. It's just easier to get somebody who knows how to race and handle pigeons than get the average Tommy who may have never seen a pigeon in his life in that sense and try and train him to do it too. And the fact that they extend the age bracket as well, because a lot of the pigeon racing and fancying tends to be a sport that you get into as you're a bit older and you've got a bit more time, perhaps a bit more money to spend on your pigeon flocks. They extend the age to 49. And also it shows that the people who are going to be releasing the pigeons and caring for them in their coops are not necessarily going to be in the front line firing machine guns and throwing grenades. You are going to be a bit further behind the line. And that, I think, brings us to another point, Dan, that it's one thing to have the pigeons. You've got them in a coop behind the lines, you release them, or you take them into battle, you release them, and then they fly back to their home coop. But actually, through 1915, we see the carrier pigeon service start to assume its more traditional form, because it's yes, you can just do that, and in 1914 that happens a lot. But all armies, French, German, and British, quite quickly start standardizing how they're going to operate carrier pigeons. And the broad outlines, it varies a little bit depending on what part of the front you're in, what period of the war it is, what's actually happening at that side of the front. But broadly, you're going to have most of your coup are going to be back at a headquarters. Can be as low down as brigade, so about 4,000 men. Pretty rare in the British Army, it has to be said. That's too close to the front line. More likely to be at divisional, corps, or even army, so further back. That's where you're going to base your pigeons. You've got all the resources there. They can be looked after. They can be fed. They're safe. They're unlikely to be blown up in their coup. And then prior to a battle, certain pigeons will be caged. They'll be placed in small cages. They'll be taken to the front line, and they'll be put initially in a forward station where, again, they can be fed and cared for. And then from the forward station, they can be distributed down to the fighting forces. And the cages that the pigeons will be in, often quite small enough to attach to a pack. And again, the numbers vary, but quite often you'll have a couple of guys designated to carry a pigeon on their pack. A slightly strange experience, but how else are you going to carry them into battle? Only, of course, to be released once you need to send a message. And these pigeons are considered very valuable. In fact, if the man carrying them is killed or wounded, and this is true across all the armies, then it's really important if the pigeon is still alive and unaided, well, your man is down, you've got to take the pigeon off, and the next man will carry him, which the emphasis placed on you've got to keep the pigeons moving forward with you. It shows how important they are, Dan, because once you are beyond the trenches and you're fighting in the enemy trenches, this applies to the Germans, French, British equally, the only communication form you have is either sending a man carrying a message, incredibly dangerous, or releasing one of your pigeons. So these are a precious resource.
I wonder, I don't know whether you can think of anything else here, but I suspect it's one of the only bits of kit that a soldier that's been wounded or killed that you would actually stop for and collect. Almost everything else that a soldier carries into battle, I can't really think of anything that you would stop for, with the exception of something like that. And that gives you an idea of just how important a resource it is, as you say. So, let's maybe try and create a little scenario here to kind of consider exactly how that might work. And let's take some battle in 1915, for example, the Battle of Loos or Los. This is the first time that really you get this formalized forward stations, which include pigeon coops, and then going back to pigeon lofts in the rear areas. So it's almost, as you say, Spence, these resources are brought forward to a forward supply base where you have ammunition, you'll maybe have grenades getting handed out. And as platoons come up the line, they'll be collecting their gear for going over the top, which might be a gas hood, At that time, it might be the newfangled Mills bombs. Each of these guys have been told, okay, you're going to take a reel of barbed wire, you're going to take this, you're going to take that, and somebody's got to pick up the pigeon. And that's your job. You're going into the Battle of Loos looking after a pigeon. Well, as you say, it's actually an incredibly valuable resource. Now, in terms of it getting used on the battlefield, I'm sure most of the people listening to this are going to understand that, of course, a paper message, a literal message that's been written, is going to be attached to a little cylinder that is also attached to the pigeon's leg. So you put your message in there. It might be something relating some coordinates. It might be something if you've got a unit cut off. It may be something requesting reinforcements or supplies. Typically, it will be a one-way message. It doesn't necessarily require a responding message, but rather it's a directive because, of course, you're not going to get a message back in anything like short term. So it could be informing somebody of your current situation and what you're planning to do next. So that will then go typically back to a loft which is close to, but not in, a headquarters. So the very first lofts, one is a mobile loft, and we'll come on to this, is actually about 7 kilometers from General Army headquarters, General Headquarters. And those pigeons that fly back are going to fly back into that location about 7 k's away, at which point the message is going to be taken off the pigeon and put into the hands of a dispatch rider on a motorbike who's then going to travel the distance to the nearest signal station. That signal then gets transmitted with the message. So that's the general process. You've literally got somebody waiting by the pigeon loft, and they've got a bell on the door where the pigeon goes in. It's a fairly simple process. The bell rings. Oh, we've had a pigeon back. Go up there, find out which pigeon it is, take the message out, away it goes. So this is actually becomes quite a slick process as time goes on. That being said, pigeons aren't infallible, Spence. They can't fly in all weathers. They can't fly in certain conditions. They're a resource that you need to use carefully. And like every other animal out there, they're subject to all manner of risks and dangers as well.
They are. This is not a safe environment for pigeons. And you mentioned a great point, I think, Dan, that retrieving carrier pigeons from wounded or killed soldiers might be the only time. Possibly, if somebody goes down with a bag of grenades, you might retrieve those. But generally, in terms of it always being laid out by all the armies, you've got to keep the pigeons. Very, very interesting. But of course, the pigeons aren't bulletproof. They are small. They are small targets. But there's so much lead flying around that there's a high chance that they're going to be killed. Also, too, they are more vulnerable to just concussion waves from explosions than humans. They're much smaller birds. They don't have the ability to resist those kind of blast waves. So even near misses from high explosive can kill and disable pigeons. So it's very dangerous just getting them into the front line as well. And then when you have them, of course, you don't have that many. Even if all your pigeons make it to the front line, you probably won't have more than 2. As a battalion, you've got to decide when you release these. These are really crucial pieces of information. And early on in the war, the pigeon tends to get released and runners go out as well, just to be absolutely certain. It's only later in the war when it's clear that the pigeons are more reliable than runners, plus you don't have to send a guy out who might get killed or wounded, that you see more and more pigeon use, and indeed more and more pigeons actually going into the front line. But from launching and then actually getting back, although, as we've said, 95% success rate from launches. If you can get them launched, there's a high chance they're going to make it. Still a chance they might get killed. There's barrages going off. There's shells flying through the air. They might get lost or disoriented. They might have been hurt crossing no man's land, and the unit that's releasing them just doesn't realize that they're injured and just sets them off as well. They might be predated on. Because once you get away from the battlefield, there are, of course, hunting birds that are roaming, and they will quite happily eat carrier pigeons as well. In fact, later in the war, the Germans try and use falconeers deliberately to intercept carrier pigeons, although the overall hit rate of those, the overall success rate might be a little bit doubted. Particularly, birds of prey don't like flying through extreme battle areas, battle zones either, so it's risky for them. But what's interesting is the fact that once you've released this carrier pigeon, you can't come back. So you need to really work out what you want to say on that carrier pigeon message as quickly as possible. And similarly, the little strip of paper that you're going to put in its message carrying ringlet around its ankle, it's not that big. So you can't write an essay on this. You're going to have to really choose your words carefully. Generally, they'll be used for a handful of things. One, to announce that a unit is somewhere. That's important, particularly if it's where it's not supposed to be and you need to urgently let somebody know. It might be to call for immediate fire support if there's something bad happening, a counterattack is starting to form up. You can see the Germans, or indeed the French or the British, depending on what side you're on, starting to mass, and you want some spoiling fire put into that. That's fast. Time is of the essence. Carrier pigeons useful for that. Or equally, if you're under friendly fire, if you're getting hammered by your own shells, if a barrage is dropping short or you're being fired on in error and you just want it to stop, sending a carrier pigeon can be extremely valuable. But they are a precious resource. And there is a time delay as well. You made a great point, Dan, that they fly back to their coup. They arrive, their message is read, and then it still has to be transmitted again. It's not necessarily a case of it lands in, I don't know, Douglas Haig's lap or Erich von Falkenhayn's lap, and he reads it and he understands exactly what's happening. It still has to be translated, so there is still a time delay. And yet, through pretty much all of the First World War, this is going to be your fastest, most reliable form of communication once you are in the thick of battle. Attempts to carry telephones forward just don't work. Telephone lines get cut. Wireless is huge and bulky and not that reliable unless you are in a nice stable place. The front line is not a nice stable place. Sending runners, we've mentioned many times now, high risk of being killed and wounded, and slow. Even if they make it to where they're meant to go, it's slow. Carrier pigeons are the definitive battlefield piece of communication.
They really are. And, it's no great surprise that the numbers increase exponentially as, the early part of the war progresses, really to the mid phases. And I say, really, it's that static trench warfare phase where carrier pigeons really come into their own. Because during that time, birds can literally be trained to operate along roads, along lines, physical locations. It might just be that they're going from location to location. And you can take a young bird referred to as squeakers at the time, which is an immature pigeon, and they can be trained. And, depending on the quality of the pigeon, because different types of pigeon work better in different situations, they'll be kind of brought up along the ranks. So they might start off running A to B runs along a dead straight road between 2 points. Then they're going to start going further up the line or in more complex situations. And eventually it's the really experienced birds that are going to be going into the front lines. It's going to be those birds that are going to be released. And of course, these are the hottest commodities. And they're also the ones that are most likely to get killed. And I find it incredibly interesting how this progresses, because by 1917, just in a quiet area, the Somme in 1917, relatively quiet area, throughout that year, there were 12,000 birds operating just up and down on the British side of the line. There's staggering numbers. But, clearly they're being used because they're working. They're proving effective on the battlefield. Now, it's not to say they can be used in all conditions. Like anything else, they're fallible. They can't be flying in fog. They can't fly at night, really. They can't fly in very high winds. So all of these things need to be taken into account. But what they can do is some pretty remarkable stuff. And this is where we get, I think, one of those iconic moments, Spence, where you get the true crossover of ancient warfare with modern warfare. And I think one of them, for me, I'm thinking in my mind here of one particular picture, which I think sums up the use of carrier pigeons in the Great War. And it's a famous picture in the Imperial War Museum of somebody holding a pigeon in their hand, passing it out of a specially built hatch in a brand new tank. This is that great crossover.
It really is, and that is one of the great pictures, I think, and sometimes used. I've seen it used as a sort of way to say, how ridiculous. You've got the most advanced land fighting vehicle in the world, a tank, and the only way you can communicate effectively from it is through a pigeon. Well, as we've been explaining this episode, in actual fact, this is a great way to communicate, especially for tanks in the First World War, where you can't go into battle with any kind of telephone or radio. There are wireless tanks and there are telephone tanks introduced, but they have their problems too. If you're in a tank and you've gone deep into the German position, and you know where you are, you want to get that back. what better way than to actually send a carrier pigeon? And so tanks go into battle, both British and French tanks will go into battle with carrier pigeons actually in their crew compartments as well, which must have been pretty ghastly for the pigeons, given how the temperatures in there, given the risk of pieces of metal flying around when bullets are hitting the exterior of the tank, and of course carbon monoxide poisoning, which can be fatal to pigeons, just as it can be very debilitating to humans. But the very fact that you can do this, I think, actually shows this isn't something to mock. This isn't something to sort of roll our eyes at. This is a very, very effective solution to an intractable problem. How do you communicate in battle? And there is no technology that can substitute for a pigeon. Hence why they're used in such a massive scale down across all the armies, and more, in fact, as the war goes on. And perhaps because they're so ubiquitous, they're so useful, they also start to become famous because they can be a wonderful sort of feel-good story in any national army. Pigeons themselves aren't just numbers back in their pigeon queue. They'll often be named. They'll often pick up nicknames and things. We've mentioned before, the British Army actively recruits pigeon experts who care for their birds. And we see similar things in other national armies too. And so they start to assume identities as well. And these are great news stories to share with a wider public, that not only are the soldiers heroes, but so too are the pigeons. And it actually leads to some very famous pigeons achieving reputations that I think endure a century on.
Yeah, we've got to talk about the famous pigeon of the Great War. It goes by the name of cher ami, dear friend, which is actually a British bird. So it's a British racing pigeon, which has been brought up in the war years and has been gifted to our gallant American allies when they come over. They acquire some kit from the French, acquire some kit from the British, and acquire some pigeons from the British as well. So cher ami is raised, born and raised in the UK, and then is attached to the US Signal Corps. And she finds herself in October of 1918 during a very famous incident in the Argonne Forest. In fact, you and I were there fairly recently, Spence. And cher ami is one of 3 pigeons to go into an attack, which is led by a Major Charles Whittlesey, which becomes over an 8-day period a famous incident that we've covered on this podcast before, known as the Lost Battalion. Now, they're not a battalion and they're not lost. And even the cher ami story's got a little bit of that concept to it. But cher ami is one of those 3 pigeons that is taken up into the front line. And this is exactly, by the way, exactly what pigeons are designed to do. If you've got a unit that's lost that just wants to tell you where they are, a pigeon is going to be perfect for that. So Whittlesey and his men get cut off about a kilometre and a half from the main line, and it's difficult to pin them down exactly. Turns out they're on their objective, and they have been the whole time. But they get surrounded by German troops, and as a result of that, they start to come under heavy fire. Now, during that process, American artillery back on the main line realizes too that Whittlesey's under heavy fire. And whilst there's an attempt to get some guys forward in order to, if possible, relieve them, they just can't break through. But artillery fire is put down. Unfortunately, the coordinates that are sent across are incorrect. As a result of that, Whittlesey's men take something like 100 casualties to artillery. He sends off his 3 birds. First bird is killed. Second bird is killed, leaving only cher ami. And just as he attaches a famous note directly to her, a shell lands nearby. She hits the ground and he thinks that she's dead as well. Actually, she struggles to her feet, bleeding, and eventually flies off and is going to make it back. It covers a staggering 25 miles in 25 minutes. Is going to make it back to American headquarters carrying this precise message. We're along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is firing a barrage on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. That lands in the American headquarters, and a great, fantastic story. As it happens, and not to take away from cher ami's brave deeds here, they've actually already realized that the mistake has been made and they've corrected it. But certainly that would have done the trick had that not been the case. Cher ami makes it with a hole through her wing, 1 leg missing, and by all accounts is going to die. But because of this incredible bravery shown by this pigeon, who has shown previous bravery in the skies before, the battalion's own surgeon is going to operate on cher ami. And they even end up, believe it or not, with an artificial wooden leg for the pigeon. Pigeon is taken back to, this is a slightly ridiculous story, I have to say. The Pigeon is taken back to the United States, put on a ship, seen off by none other than General Pershing himself, who salutes the Pigeon as it makes its way back to the United States. Eventually is going to go back and dies in New Jersey in 1919. And then, I don't know if this is a good thing or not, after her death, she is stuffed and put on display in the Smithsonian Museum. But what an incredible life for a pigeon that stands for, I think, all carrier pigeons in the Great War, Spence.
Yeah, I think that's a great story. Really emphasized a few things, what you've already been talking about. One, you use carrier pigeons in absolute emergencies. So the last battalion's getting pounded, got to stop this. It's causing massive casualties. So use a carrier pigeon. Secondly, the resilience of carrier pigeons. He's badly injured and has basically he's going to die if it's not operated on at the end of this, but still gets through, which shows how resilient pigeons are. That sometimes pigeons it's observed pigeons make it back to their home coop with all kinds of terrible injuries, missing eyes, missing feet, shrapnel injuries, gas injuries as well. Although you might think, listeners, well, surely pigeons are going to suffer a lot from gas. Well, potentially, yes. And this actually does become a problem with carrying pigeons through areas that have been heavily gassed. But pigeons, once they're, of course, in the air, are actually basically free from gas. Gas is low to the ground. And even pigeons that are being gassed or in areas that are gassed show surprising degrees of resilience to it, possibly because they don't breathe as much. Although you still don't want your pigeons to be subjected to it. So it shows that the absolute resilience of pigeons and therefore how useful and reliable they are. And it shows what a fascination they are to the public. That particularly in Britain, where Britain even then is a nation of animal lovers, distinct, I would say, actually, from France, where animals are, in fact, one of the things that shocks British soldiers is how poorly animals can be treated in Belgium and France compared to at home. Particularly in Britain and by extension the United States and the British Empire, the image of the brave, the plucky carrier pigeon getting through over everything is a sort of wonderful good news story. You see similar things with dogs as well. That's a topic for another day. Messenger dogs and rescue dogs in all armies, actually, but especially in the British Army, get all kinds of press reporting about them, about how brave they are and how noble they are. And the public absolutely laps this up, which is why there is still a stuffed pigeon in the Smithsonian, Dan. But it's a great story, not only because of it's almost the sheer heroism, the determination of the pigeon, but also for showing exactly what we've been talking about, that this is a genuinely useful piece of communications. Yes, it has its limitations. Pigeons are one way. You can't put a big message on a pigeon and so on. But in the context of the First World War, the very fact that hundreds of thousands of pigeons are used by all the combatants, testament, I think, to how useful they are.
And I think, really the proof's in the pudding with this kind of thing. And I think we can say without hesitation that pigeons save lives in the Great War. There are numerous instances, not just things like the Lost Battalion, where you get these kind of incidents where friendly artillery fire is smashing into a unit, but also the other locations that pigeons are taken. For example, they're taken on seaplanes, they're taken in submarines, and on more than one occasion, there have been, for example, a seaplane that's been forced to ditch into the ocean, need to be within about 500 miles of land, but a pigeon can be sent out. This kind of stuff that we're talking about with U-boats recently, or ships that have been sunk. There were a number of these guys, had they had a carrier pigeon, they could have sent one off with some coordinates, giving some detail, giving some precise information, and rescue can come to them. This doesn't rely on antennas or radios, or even you having a ship. If you've got a dinghy and a pigeon, you've got a chance of getting a message away. There is no other method. No other method exists at that time. If you're beyond line of sight of the nearest help and you're in a dinghy, you're relying on pure chance for somebody to come and get you. That's it. There's no more than that. If you've got a pigeon in your hand, that chance changes. And I think that's really a powerful testament to their real efficiency.
I think so. And just the comment about U-boats, it's interesting that very early in the war, although this doesn't continue later on, but early in the war, when the German Navy is thinking about operating U-boats relatively close to the coast, so North Sea and in the Baltic and things, some U-boats actually go to sea. Some of the larger boats, the U-class rather than the UBs and UCs, go to sea with carrier pigeons. And the idea is if the submarine is in distress, it's having problems, you can launch the carrier pigeon and rescue can be summoned. And the German Navy operates carrier pigeons in this sense. They don't carry on in the war because by then the U-boats are operating so far out in the western approaches the Atlantic, carrier pigeon just can't get anywhere. And even if it did, what's going to happen? Well, nobody's going to be able to rescue you. But fascinating that it's thought of in this way. In early aerial reconnaissance from the British, there's ideas about putting carrier pigeons in aerial reconnaissance planes, particularly naval reconnaissance planes, because they can send messages back. And British solved that problem, as do all the armies, by getting wireless sets into aircraft. But even they're only one way for most of the war. You can send a signal out, you can't receive a signal back. And they have all kinds of problems. They're very technically demanding and everything else. And so in the midst of all this, in the midst of the most technologically advanced war in human history, between 14 and 18, up until that point, the absolute core of communication for all the armies is going to be the humble carrier pigeon.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
And we didn't get a single stop the pigeon joke in. Devastated. Oh, how could we not mention Dick Dastardly and Muttley?
Yeah, should have done. Well, you can get them in the outtakes now.
Yeah, excellent. Give me a medal. Give me a medal.
Yeah, excellent.